Welcome everyone, and it is really so lovely to be joined by so many lovely people. Thank you for being part of our Greenprints webinar today. I'm going to share screen in a moment and acknowledge country, and we'll kick off the event. And I'm actually seeing some faces from present and past. So hello to everyone, including folks I have not seen for many decades. So hello everyone, my name is Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. And I'm really pleased to share with you today an introduction to the Greenprints approach. We often call it the Greenprints Initiative or the Greenprints program. Greenprints was the nickname that started because Greenprints are just a play on the idea of designing and playing with blueprints. But I'll tell you more about that in a minute. I'd like to acknowledge country. I often use this beautiful photo to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the beautiful lands of the Yagara Turrbal peoples here in North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the remarkable governance system and civilizational culture that has cared for country and cared for kin since time immemorial. I work with many Indigenous friends and colleagues and am constantly in awe of the way they relate to each other, care for country, and share with us their remarkable civilizational cultural knowledge. I'm in deep awe of it. I also like to acknowledge the ongoing impacts and legacy of colonisation and all of the impacts that have happened on this continent since 1788. And for any of you who know me and the various groups I work with, everything we do, we try to do as best we can in the spirit of decolonising our hearts and minds so that we can care for our continent and each other, and the plants and the animals, the entire Earth community in an appropriate and proper way. So my presentation today will be lots of different slides, but, and can I just remind folks to stay on mute? I can hear some interference. Thank you. In this presentation, there are 4 parts. There's a lot of slides because I'm very visual. I'm going to give you the context and background for the Greenprints approach and how it was born out of the work we do inside the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. I'll introduce the really simplified Greenprint steps, and then I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about how they work and what they're meant to be doing. And then I'll give you some ideas about how you might like to connect or get involved if you'd like to. So please sit back, relax and enjoy, I hope, a weird and wonderful overview of some of this remarkable work that myself and my colleagues have been researching and piloting and experimenting and discussing and talking about for a number of years. So first, the context and background. Before I do that, perhaps you could note the beautiful logo for Greenprints and how it represents human beings patterning themselves inside ecological limits or ecological health. And it also mirrors the AELA leaf logo. I like to point it out because that sort of tells the whole story. How do we pattern ourselves into our living world? But the context and background for Greenprints. So the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, or AELA, which is the organisation I co-founded with a number of other environmental lawyers in 2012, has been working to create systems change. Our interest is how do we shift modern industrialised societies from human-centred, growth-focused governance to earth-centred or life-centred governance. And the 2 images that are shown there really capture that as effectively as many thousands of words. How do we take our worldview, this idea that is captured in many aspects of Western religion, Western law, economics, and history, this idea that we have in our institutional structures, at least, that human beings are the first most important thing, and everyone else, all the other creatures, are less than us. How do we shift back to what many Indigenous cultures have always had and never lost, and perhaps our own ancestors, and I speak from someone who's a descendant of the Irish who came to Australia. So we're very interested in what the world could look like in modern industrialised societies, particularly those influenced by Western thinking, if we see all of the living world as not only beautiful and cute and amazing and delightful, but an integral part of our community. So AELA's work since 2012 has been influenced by a couple of things, which I'll talk about in a moment: earth jurisprudence and Indigenous knowledge systems. But really at the beginning, we started looking at the role of law in perpetuating environmental harm. And we were very interested and still are in rights of nature, earth laws, ecological law, and other emerging concepts like ecocide. But because of the nature of our work, we're profoundly interested in these underpinning governance structures in modern industrialized societies, which Thomas Berry and Earth jurisprudence would articulate as these core institutional structures where human activities kind of are governed by certain groups in society that have a certain worldview. And the primary focus of the analysis in Earth jurisprudence is law, economics, religion, and education. And in that analysis, Berry and others looking at Earth jurisprudence and Earth laws would suggest that for whatever reason, just the way things developed in Europe, the way things have developed in modern technological society, these underpinning structures are built on anthropocentrism or human-centeredness and do not take into regard and do not respect the rest of the living world. And so it's unpicking those systems and restitching new ones that AELA has become quite obsessed with and really interested in. And the image there on the right shows our logo, but also the kinds of fluid themes that a lot of our work connects around: changing culture, because it's the cultural, ethical, moral understandings in our value system that guide so much of the other structural things. Reconnecting our law and governance and economics with life, that which matters, building community capacity, and creating really cool, valid alternatives to the current status quo. And of course, transforming law and structure. And this fluid connection of ideas is really the heartland of where Greenprints has emerged from. Not one particular Western discipline, not one particular scale of thinking, and not one particular field of work. It's emerged from looking across all of it. So I've already mentioned Earth jurisprudence, but AELA's inspiration is deeply embedded in this Western critique of Western systems, which comes from Earth jurisprudence and many other deep ecologists and social ecologists. But equally, me personally, I've always been in really deep awe of Indigenous cultures and the way they consider themselves in the landscape, the way they treat plants and animals as relatives, as deeply connected. I actually love this worldview, so I've always been interested, but I must pay homage to some remarkable elders and mentors in my life. Mary Graham, who I think is one of Australia's leading thinkers and philosophers, her work including relationist ethos, the law of obligation and autonomous regard, and Anne Paulina from the Kimberley, and her incredible body of work looking at Indigenous first laws. So this is the inspiration for our work. We don't claim to own or take any of that, but we are inspired by these knowledge systems and thinking, and have been trying to turn a lot of these ideas into practice, particularly with a view at looking at the 96% of the Australian population that are not Indigenous. Our people, my people, the folks who grapple with how to be good earthlings on this continent in a colonial situation. You know, how do we work it out and do good things? So the origins of Greenprints at a personal level, the short story, and I've actually written a little blog about this, but the short story is I've been really lucky since finishing high school and doing university to have worked around the world and around Australia with a very diverse multidisciplinary range of folks: Indigenous peoples, lawyers, regulators, economists, folks in national parks, NRM, catchment management, wildlife carers, state governments, amazing civil society, environmental groups, etc. And the reason that's important is that in mid-2015, when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I was very, very sick with lots and lots of treatment and was stuck in bed for nearly 6 months, very unable to do much of anything but think. And it was that wonderful thinking time when I started to think about all of the work I'd been involved in, all of the efforts I could see in Western society, and started to piece together, what if we could all bring all of that together into a way that helped us understand how to live within our ecological limits. I had, just before I got cancer, I had just finished my PhD, which my formal background's law and politics and history, but the PhD looked at regulatory approaches, how we could bring people together to do a kind of collective response to reducing consumption. And it was a real privilege to be engaged in research and literature reviews that exposed me to some of the best thinking at that time around our ecological limits, planetary boundaries, and ways forward. So on to Greenprints. The Greenprints vision in very, very simple terms is thinking about having a regenerative human society or regenerative human societies that thrive within our ecological limits and support the living world. This is very much an ecocentric way of looking out at the world. This is our beautiful banner, which you'll see little images from throughout the presentation. It's meant to represent a very cheerful, beautiful, vibrant, and built on the foundations of Indigenous culture image of what our future and feeling of our world could be. Another way to think about what Greenprints is interested in is, in Western scientific terms, our vision is healthy bioregions and peoples across the continent. Not a standardized approach to ecological health, not standardized laws that don't really apply to different places, but unique, local, bioregional, caring for country, where rainforests are beautiful rainforests, where deserts are amazing deserts, and when all of the life forms unique to those places, including the people, can be respected and they can thrive together. Another way of articulating this is, how do we work together across Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledge systems to ensure that the remarkable governance systems of First Nations peoples can continue and flourish and guide modern Australian society? So that's a vision, but how do we get there? And I'm sure we've all got lots of experience in all the good things that are going on. There is so much excellent work going on in trying to protect the environment and care for people. But how do we actually shift from being at a societal structural level, fundamentally about growth and fundamentally about extractivism, the constant taking up, logging, mining, using up without actually replenishing Mother Earth? How do we shift from that to a different kind of society, not just in an economic way, not just in an ecological way, but in a civilizational way? How do we bring everyone with us as well? And how do we avoid what always happens with greenwashed sustainability approaches? Great ideas pop up, and then corporations and other vested interests who know they can make money out of it if they can just wrap their arms around it, often greenwash, take over, and don't solve the problem. So before I tell you about Greenprints and why we've been working on it just as a basic scaffolding for all of the different things we're interested in, this quote's really important. So we come to you with humility. We are sharing with you something we've been working on and that we think could be of use, but it ain't everything. It's not perfect. It's lumpy and it's wonky. And I love this quote by this bloke called George E.P. Box. All models are wrong. Some are useful. Please keep that in your mind when I tell you about Greenprints. We have worked to bring lots of complexity together, but we've tried to then simplify it so that even school kids can understand one way of thinking about bringing all the good stuff together. So the blurb about Greenprints. So Greenprints was designed to provide a practical step-by-step approach to help anyone understand the big picture as well as the small details of how to transform our societies and thrive within our limits. It also aims to demystify and connect the many varied concepts, models, and methods that can be used to create sustainable and regenerative communities, organisations, and societies. We like to stress that Greenprints is a process, and if we follow the process and if we do the work, we can actually create some outputs that can inform our thinking about exactly what we're transforming life towards and what we're changing from. So it's a process because the years of research and work we've done has been actually trying to work out all of the good stuff that's out there and at what scale and at what point is some of these tools useful and when they're not. So Greenprints offers an earth-centered process, manageable steps to help us find and use the best stuff that's out there. So it's not inventing something new, it's created a pathway through the myriad and many, many opportunities to do good things. But it can also be an output. And this is where something that we feel is really important to democratize both general information in society and to democratize people's understanding of what's possible. So much of the information in Australia is held up by governments or private entities who've got the funds to do the research, to understand places, to make 20 and 30-year development plans, and ordinary community groups are left trying to respond to every new development for their local area. What we're interested in is lots and lots of people coming together to understand what's happened in place, whatever scale you're looking at, and to think about the future together, to think about what this place can really sustain and how do we work towards achieving that. So Greenprints is keen to kind of work through the process to develop viable alternatives to business as usual. And if anyone knows about scenario planning, there's lots of different theories, as everything that's ever developed by Western culture has lots of different ways of doing it. But what we're most interested in is how people can seriously engage with an understanding of what's possible and what's not possible, what we can do, and perhaps what we have to change or give up. The only final bit of theory in terms of the justification for why we've done this is this slide here. Greenprints comes from a particular bias. It comes from a critique of the current extractivist system that I myself live within. It's not about business as usual. It's not about techno-fix. We're very interested in how we can look at alternatives to create a transition by design, something deliberate, but something that buys into a different worldview, a different economic system, a slightly different legal and governance system, and also looking at where power and decision-making lies. So we're trying to shift away from human-centered, patriarchal, colonial, modernity and ideas of nature as property towards earth-centered, decolonized, living within our ecological limits kinds of thinking. We're interested in moving away from this idea of endless growth, that capitalism is the only way, that expansionism and extractivism is acceptable. We're interested in everything that you might frame around steady state or regenerative or post-extractivism. Doughnut Economics has some good, valuable things to add. Fundamentally, we just want to have a regenerative space where things keep living and keep breathing and keep moving into a lively future. I won't talk too much today about the law and governance thinking behind Greenprints, but there's an entire body of work that we're exploring that uses an analysis of what healthy bioregions and estates for traditional owners look like, and working backwards to change the legal system to be more appropriate to local place. For anyone who's interested, please connect. We'll be building a lot of networks of lawyers, regulators, and people interested in this space. But there's a whole story that we can tell about the top-down nature of law in Western systems, which is very, very different to how most people live their life and very different to the example of governance that we've seen in Indigenous societies. And finally, Greenprints aims through both the way it works, the broad range of folks we hope to bring in, but also with the ultimate end game. We really want to challenge where power lies within Australia, because so much power is allegedly possessed by high-level government, high-level elite corporates, and I just see so many community groups struggling with unwanted development in their place, in their home, and these are issues that need to be addressed. All right, trying to find the buttons. So that's all well and good. We've got this idea of a lovely future, most people do, but how do we get there? And as I've already said, Greenprints, we've worked hard to make some simple steps, not so we can publish a book going the 7 easy steps to success or something, but just to keep saying we are living and breathing the experience of trying to work in a space called sustainability or regenerative everything. We know how hard it is to keep track of all of the cool things and to keep sane in a sea of ideas and information and misinformation. So first and foremost, Greenprints, I often joke, is a sanity pill. When the world is too crazy, just hang on to these simple steps and maybe they might help. They certainly help me. They might not help everyone. I also like to joke that I call Greenprints the sturdy steps through the sometimes swampy stuff of sustainability. The alliteration disguises probably just the deep need in someone like me to hang on to some level of clarity, whilst the greenwashing and all of the misinformation strategies confuse the good things that we can do. So the steps, very quickly. Step 1, think differently. Step 2, define ecological boundaries. Step 3, Understand those ecological foundations within the boundaries that you set for your thinking, your project, your regenerative work. Step 4 is huge, and we'll talk about it in more detail. Understand human activities in this place. Understand the history, the past, and business as usual, and what's going to happen in the future if we keep up with business as usual. Somewhere at some scale, try to work out, are we in overshoot? So many people talk about change without really even understanding what they're changing to or from in any kind of connected way. So step 5 is health check. Whatever ecological boundaries you've put your arms around or drawn a line around, the human activities you're looking at, how are we going? What's going on? Then develop scenarios for change unique to place. This is not all done in abstract. And from those scenarios, we then need stuff we would have created at the very beginning of these steps, more and more people involved in collective decision-making. We can talk about that in deep detail if you want. And then after all that work, then we can develop the kinds of action plans that bring together all of the good stuff that's already going on, but perhaps it will help by making sure that everyone's pointing in roughly the same direction. And then there's the Greenprints steps with the feedback loop. There is no perfect end, we will do this and therefore we are finished. It's about bringing together enough people, all of the good ideas to understand the directions we could take, and then constantly having a look back at what have we achieved? What have we really done? What else should be done? And of course, all models are wrong. Some are useful. This is just a model for thinking to stay sane. The Greenprint steps are kind of reflective of any model example of systems change approaches with diagnosing, planning, and taking action, then reviewing and tweaking and continuing. None of that's mysterious. The other thing I want to mention, and I say this a lot, is the steps are really just a logical way to think about, in theory, how we could analyze the very important systems change we have to make in our society. But real life is messy, iterative, round and round, full of feedback loops, barriers, and the steps all muddle and bleed together. So in a lot of the deeper work we do in Greenprints, I'm always talking about different animals. So there is no snail of destiny. There is no perfect way to do this. There is no big tick at the end to say, hey, you did it, you got there. There's just the endless work and effort and reassessment and reviewing. So there is no snail of destiny, but if we follow the steps, you could at least in theory pull together the very best of our options for a much better future. So the steps in more detail. I actually have no idea how long I've been talking. I put myself in a room with no clock, good on me. James or Kira, if you could perhaps pop in the chat what the time is, that'd be great. So the steps in more detail, and we're really happy to chat to you about this now, or if you're interested in connecting with us more deeply after I tell you a bit more, just get in touch anytime. We're super keen to work with as many people as possible. So the Greenprint steps, each of those profoundly simple steps that kids understand represents a whole bunch of research and ideas behind it and justifications. And the following slides just give a little glimpse into what each step is about. And remember, you don't have to do them in neat, perfect order. It's just a way of telling a story about understanding information. So what we do within the Greenprints team with a couple of the projects we've already started is we start what we call a Greenprints workbook. It's just a simple way to bring it all together. And the one thing I haven't mentioned in the steps is the remarkable work that James Lee and a few other folks who've helped and myself have been doing on a bunch of mapping tools, ways to really democratize an understanding of what's going on in a place. So the workbook is all about collating the core elements of really important info into one place for everybody. Believe it or not, the very first step is the hardest. Making action is very hard, absolutely, but getting your average Westerner to think really differently about our culture, our impacts, the way we work, the way we think. This has certainly in my 30 years or 30 years plus of work experience has proven to be one of the most challenging. How do you get people who think that the world is built for people and that all of life out there is a resource? How do you get them to think differently? These are some of the challenges. And even those who care and love the environment, when it comes down to it, we've run everything from citizens' tribunals to Council of All Beings to youth ecological justice tribunals people still get caught up on the idea that ultimately it's what people want that is the most important thing. And one of the things we do with the Think Differently aspect is really remind people, not only do we rely on the interconnected web of life for our own survival, but we have no moral obligation, no moral right to take away and make extinct these other species. And once you take that as the fundamental starting point, everything else looks very different. There are so many of tools that we use in Western society that do not take into account non-human interests. And once you put them in the picture, some of the constraints that come upon human decision-making become very revealed. The other thing that's really important to us is from the beginning, we work with Indigenous peoples in whatever space we're in, and we have a lot of advisors and terrific elders who we work with to make sure that to our best of our ability, we're thinking differently from not just the Western way of being. Some of the concepts in the West are brilliant, but that we respect the fact that the oldest continuous culture on earth lives and has always lived in Australia. And we have to work together to really honour and decolonise the work we do. So there's a whole body of work around thinking differently, but all I would urge you to think about is that it starts with thinking about the interconnected web of life. Mary, I see your hand is raised. If you could write in the chat, we'll just wait until the end, then we'll take your question. Thank you. So how do we do the thinking differently? How do we do any of this? I'll talk a bit about that as we go through, but the thinking differently really just starts with whoever we've started with. And some people already think in an earth-centered way or challenge a lot of the dominant economic systems, but some people don't. So we stress this, but we're learning, exploring together through discussions, compassionate conversations. But remember, it's iterative. So this part of Think Differently, we challenge ourselves and others we work with throughout every step and every piece of research we do. It's really important to just keep that dialogue open. And you'll see there I've got retrofit. A lot of what Greenprints is about is actually taking great tools, but thinking about the best place to work with them. So for example, Doughnut Economics, I'm a huge fan. And it talks about how do we ensure that inside the beautiful concept of planetary boundaries, how do we make sure there's a safe and just space for humanity? What we've done in Greenprints is vivid here in this image. We've retrofitted the original donut to be ecocentric. The Greenprints donut says, how do we rethink human society so that people have enough, but that there's living space for the whole Earth community? Now, to many of you listening to this, I'm sure none of this is new. I think anyone joining a Greenprints discussion is probably already thinks, how do we make sure that the living world is continued? But even in a concept as powerful and popular as Doughnut Economics, it still firstly focuses on human needs and wants. It doesn't actually ask, what are our bioregional foundations? Where do we live and how do we care about the place enough to then limit and control human urges and wants? And this is often the tough stuff to talk about. Number two, step two, define your ecological boundaries. For anyone familiar with Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning work around the commons, or anyone working with groups who just have basic common sense, if you're looking at a place, if you're trying to be sustainable, you have to actually work out where you're talking about. So much of our Western tools are focusing on the round and roundness of circular economies. It's very important, but if you don't embed your circular economy somewhere, then you've still got resources coming in and being reused, but where did they come from? Where did the waste go? What's the impact on the places we extract from? What's the impact on the places where we're recycling? So defining boundaries as a thinking exercise and as a way of saying, what scale are we working at? Are we looking regen Brisbane, for example? Is it looking at the catchment, the sub-region, the bioregion, the original Indigenous estate for the Yuggera Turrbal peoples? Whatever scale you're looking at, draw a little line on a map and say, what's actually going on in this place? How do we live here forever? How do we do what Aboriginal people did, which is sacrifice certain choices to ensure that all of life continues to exist and support life in a place, rather than the colonial attitude, which developed in the late 1500s, which is, we've run out of forests, let's go somewhere else and take theirs. And the same way that we see the elites today going, oh, maybe Earth is a bit stuffed, why don't we go to Mars? Why don't we go into the cosmos and mine the moon? This is an extension of extractivist, expansionist thinking that Europeans have been in love with for hundreds and hundreds of years. If we want to work successfully in Australia forever, we have to think more like Indigenous wisdom of, if this is our estate, if this is our place, how do we look after it forever? And I love that notion. And that's where circular time and challenging time and all those beautiful, amazing, mind-bending concepts pop into the think differently as well. So Greenprints is obsessed with local boundaries because we love this continent very much. But of course, we're also great admirers and respecters of the planet. We love our planet. So understanding planetary boundaries, finding the connecting points between the local and the global, whereas the Doughnut Economy idea is terrific because it starts with planetary boundaries. Greenprints always started with the local. But the good thing is we don't have to be unilateral. We can do all of it and bring it all together somehow in a messy, iterative, snail of destiny sort of no way. All right, so once we've worked out which patch we're playing in, and again, in the early days, a lot of that is an intellectual exercise, but ultimately it should come down to practical stuff eventually. But then you have to understand your ecological foundations. Now, again, for a lot of Westerners, this sounds simple, but ultimately, and this is what the entire theory of Earth jurisprudence is based on, most Westerners don't know much about where they live. They get in a car, they drive to work, or they work from home, they watch TV. They're not out hunting and gathering. They're not often watching the seasons. They don't know that when that tree flowers, the mullet are running, or when that bird is doing that, these berries are popping up. We are not all that connected to our place. Indigenous people will always remind us that their deep knowledge comes from deep relative connectivity to place, paying attention, needing and relying on their local resources. But for us to do any sensible systems change to care for the environment, we have to be able to understand what this place is all about. In the early days of experimenting with Greenprints for the Sunshine Coast, we had planned a one-day adventure called Our Place, where we had people who were experts on everything from the soils, the geology, the plants, vegetation, mushrooms, mycelium, plants and animals talking about the bioregion. And it was utterly delightful. We had a couple of hundred people sign up. When we had to flip over to online because of COVID, everyone still stayed on for something like 3 or 4 hours with breaks. And people just loved hearing about their place. What were the soils like? What are the plants like? What's the history of this place? So understanding our ecological foundations is not background noise. This is the heart and soul of true sustainability. There's no point trying to plan to have, I don't know, something as bizarre as cotton farming in the middle of the desert if it means it's going to kill the one and only major river. There's no point trying to do desert-like things in a rainforest or rainforest-like things in a savanna. We must start thinking about the biophysical realities of where we all live and what we can do. And that's what step 3 is all about. It's also about getting to know the fluffies and the featheries and the furries, and it's a really fun patch to actually start looking at all the animals that used to be somewhere or still are. Step 4 is huge. I won't be talking about it too much today because there's just so much in it. But step 4 is, all right, we've drawn a line around what we're interested in looking at. We've started to get to know the biophysical place, the Earth community. What have human beings been doing in this place? We look at history, Indigenous settlements, colonial settlements, the economic thinking that has come with colonialism. And then you can drill down into, depending on your interests, some of the deep, gritty material flow stuff. And a lot of people go, oh, we don't need a techno fix. Absolutely, I'm not a techno fix girl. But unless we understand, for example, for Brisbane, where does our bitumen come from? Where are our roads, our buildings, our bridges, our tunnels? Where's the stuff coming from that makes these things? Is it sustainable? When will it run out? Where's the waste going? All the stuff that we import, where's that come from? What are our impacts on bioregions far, far away with long supply chains? And we're really lucky in Greenprints through the Greenprints Exchange, which I'll talk about later if I have time. We've got some amazing folks who are all experts in their own areas, their own fields of work, who are coming into the Greenprints community to share what they know and to make as practical as possible some of these deep theoretical and already well-known tools. And this beautiful image here, thanks to James Lee for modifying your standard life cycle benefit analysis to make it look like the Greenprints material. But that's what that's all about. land use, resource consumption. And then how do we organize in that place? All the invisible stuff. Where are the power structures? How do we share? What's going on in a place? But very importantly, what's going on in this place on the foundations of our ecological systems? Then we do the health check. You can use anything. The global ecological footprint is often a useful tool. Again, it's not perfect, but it's one of the better ones. There's lots of different ways to analyze what's going on. There's a huge story about different kinds of data sets, what's actually easy to do in the Australian context and what is hard, given so much data is collected either at the national or state level, and we're much more interested in ecological boundaries than state boundaries, political boundaries. Step 6, scenario planning. This is the hard stuff, but again, you can't do scenario planning. You can't do large scale landscape analysis unless you've done the previous steps. You know, this idea of trying to do state policies and planning for the Southeast Queensland and having, you know, vaguely similar rules for somewhere like Western Queensland is ridiculous. We have to have really bioculturally sensitive ways of working and supporting true democracy at the local level. This is a big area. It's really exciting. We've got a number of folks who are experts in scenario planning, really keen to help, which is really exciting. And then even once we've worked out, say we get an idea of, well, if we did this and we transformed, for example, the Brigalow Belt bioregion has been denuded of something like 85 to 90% of its original vegetation since the 1950s and colonisation generally. That means an entire bioregion has been cleared of vegetation for cattle and sheep. So when we come to community decision making, how on earth do we use these new scenarios that we've been developing and actually bring people on board? Well, hopefully the process itself has brought a lot of people on board. But this is where cool things like community decision-making, citizens' assemblies, sortition, lots of different, more vocal ways of bringing people together to hammer out discussions about what's possible. Things that seem almost impossible in the Australian context because our democracy is modelled on let's vote every 4 years and hope that the political reps make good decisions. We need to force bright, shiny, wonderful new conversations into our discussions that are not smothered by mainstream media. And this is a very important part of the whole thing. Taking action, changing governance. Imagine we spend 2 or 3 years getting thousands of people in a bioregion actually focused on a different way of looking at stuff. And then imagine we could rearrange the legal system to embed new ways forward that are unique to place. That's, as a lawyer, my little secret dream, but I'm not sure everyone's excited by that. Very quickly, I'm going to wrap up because I do want to have time for chats, and I'm sorry that I talk so much, but there's so much in this and I just love it, as you can probably tell. Here's a really quick way to think about Greenprints a bit differently. So we've got the linear steps to keep you sane, but what does it really mean? What could it look like? So this is modern day Australia with its big straight lines. Modern day Australia often doesn't connect or understand, you know, the reality of the world that our laws are living in or our economy works within. The history of how we have built modern Australia is built around corporations, high-level government decisions, colonialism and big straight lines, but it doesn't have to be the future. This kind of vegetation loss, this way of understanding extractivism in Australia, all of the white stuff shows absolutely legal behaviour. Most of it reflects agriculture and the wheat belt and other things. And if we continue along this path, then we are going to end up with continuing extractivism at a scale that will not sustain many pockets of life in the populated areas. Aboriginal culture looked at things very differently, but even Aboriginal people know that the Western system cannot turn on a dime and change itself overnight, and many aspects of Western systems will continue. But if we take as a starting point and a middle ground the bioregions, and I'm not saying bioregions are better than catchments or anything else, but they're a way of going, well, hang on. Scientists have worked out that this place has unique qualities. How do we then look at the bioregion? So let's say, here's an example of a place. What's going on in that place? Who lives there? How do we understand the unique qualities, the biophysical realities? Look at what health looks like in this place. Modern laws have no benchmark for ecological health in a place. They just talk about what's permitted and what's allowed to be destroyed, within a certain vague planning structure. How do we nest human societies within a healthy bioregion? What does that even look like? This is where the scenarios are useful. How do we ensure there are human economies that support human beings? And this is why many of us have been building the New Economy Network Australia for 5 years, to ensure that conversations about different kinds of economic activity are viable and sensible and strong and can't just be dismissed. And then once we do this classic image of a nested sustainability idea, the really interesting thing is, how do we all fit into that? That X could be a school, it could be a town, it could be your organization. How do we locate ourselves? Mary Graham says, for Indigenous people, the Descartes quote is, I think, therefore I am. She says for Indigenous people, if there was an equivalent, it would be, I am located, therefore I am. So one of the things that Greenprints is trying to do is encourage people to really think about where they're located, what their part in the bigger picture is, and how to pattern themselves into a social movement looking across this. So if any of that made sense, if you're interested in any of it, we've got so many different ways for you to connect. You can go away and have a think and visit the website, which is still under construction, but it is live. There's a few pages that need some text, but you can join our mailing list. You can invite AELA to give a workshop to your organizations or groups or multiple groups and talk about what it could look like. You could join up with an existing initiative. We've got a page on our website called Stories, where we've just got a few people and groups starting to connect with and explore the body of work. The Greenprints Exchange, if you've got ideas and expertise, send us a line. We need great people all the time, or just drop us a note. The main email is greenprints@earthlaws.org.au.